Clear prop.
Star 738, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exited in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm great. Another episode, and this week is going to be about a system. It's going to be part of a system. I'm sure, as many have done check rides with you, you're a fan of the electrical system. I remember an electrical conversation happening in my check ride with you. And today we're going to let everyone hear us talk about an alternator failure. How many alternator failures have you had in your aviation career?
I have had I've had 2 alternator failures. One was in a multi-engine airplane. You have 2, so it's not as big of a deal. One was in a single-engine airplane, which resulted in a total electrical failure. It can be a big deal, maybe not such a big deal. The alternator basically is a battery charger. So we deal with this on a daily basis in our personal life, and we don't even really know it. But pretty much every one of us in our pocket has a cell phone. And at some point, that cell phone gets plugged into the wall and gets charged. And then when we leave our house or our office or wherever, we unplug that cell phone, and we are walking around with our cell phone without it being charged. So in essence, we are walking around with our cell phone having experienced an alternator failure. And we learn to manage that using our cell phones. We know if we're going to be out for, let's just say 12 hours, using your phone without the ability to charge it, you might do things with the phone. You may shut apps down. You may turn off features on the phone that use a lot of electricity.
I know my iPhone actually even warns me, and it pops up when I get to 10% and says, would you like to go to low power mode?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, it does that. And so we kind of deal with this every day, but when I get in a briefing room on a check ride and we talk about this, it seems like just such a foreign concept. If you and I, Bobby, go to a baseball game, and I look down at my phone at, we're in the 6th inning, and I'm down to 6% on my phone, I'm probably going to send the people that I care about, that I'm in touch with, a message saying, hey, I'm about to lose power on my phone. If you really need me, contact Bobby. Here's his number. So I've established kind of an alternate means of contact, and we do that all the time. We do that without even thinking about it. It's just part of our everyday life.
I don't want to take it for granted, but we both have a little bit of experience, and a lot of people. I remember when I was a newly student pilot. And I've openly said I was pretty scared of flying, not afraid, but timid and appreciative of what was going on, right? We're a couple thousand feet in the air.
Right.
There's a big fan blowing in front of us. Man, if I thought about then what I felt like if the power went off, if the plug came undone, I'm panicking. I'm really freaking out. Let's talk about what all is happening to the aircraft and to the electrical system when that alternator stops charging. What does the immediate effect to the end user, the pilot and or aircraft, as that alternator stops producing energy?
Yeah, initially the result is nothing. Nothing. I mean, everything is still working. We're not getting a charge to the battery, so we have started a time clock. The clock that most people will answer me with when we're talking about check rides is they'll say, well, we have 30 minutes of battery life. Well, the fact is, we don't know how much battery life we have. We might have 2 hours. We may have 10 minutes. We don't know.
But we use the cell phone example. We've all had a cell phone with a cruddy battery that probably needed to be plugged in a lot more each day. And
Exactly.
I'm sure there's some trainers out there that probably need a little bit more juice every day.
Right. So we don't know, but we do know that we are limited, and at some point that battery is going to fail, and we will then have a total electrical failure. One thing that I was demonstrated fairly early on in my training was to go out to the practice area, and my instructor shut the master switch off. And after I caught my breath, I mean, you can read all day that the engine is still going to run, but when he reaches over there and reaches across your lap and hits those two little red switches and flips them down, after I gasped and realized that, whoa, he's right. The engine does continue to run. And we flew around for a few minutes just for the heck of it, and he actually demonstrated that, okay, look, all your flight instruments, the ones that you really care about, your pedostatic instruments, the airspeed, altimeter, vertical speed, your gyroscopic instruments, your heading indicator, your attitude indicator are working just fine. Now, you're probably going to lose fuel gauges. Most airplanes, you're going to lose your turn coordinator. Obviously, you're going to lose your radios, all your avionics. One thing people will always tell me is they're going to squawk 7700 with an electrical failure, and I point out, well, okay, good luck doing that. It's pretty obvious on the newer transponders with a digital readout, because you won't see anything to read out. So it's pretty obvious that the transponder is not working. But as far as the airplane flying, a day VFR, VMC conditions, really the airplane is flying just fine.
Aren't there some planes out there that maybe crop dusters or whatever that don't have a battery in them? You hand prop them and they don't have any power?
Yeah. I mean, the early airplanes don't even have electrical systems.
No battery to charge,
right.
So no alternator.
Right.
Always having an alternator failure.
Right. So
the one thing that I think I thought about, my instructor did the same thing for me. They went up to the practice area, and I was nervous, and I kept talking about, we're going to fall out of the sky, and he reached over to the same thing, and I panicked. I think the most shocking thing to me was how freaking loud it got, right? We no longer had our headsets. We weren't talking. So he was screaming at me, see, nothing happened. And nothing did happen. The plane kept flying as normal. The electrical system and the battery do nothing to create the spark once the magneto's turning. So the plane should keep running without the battery or an alternator for as long as you have fuel.
That's correct, and that's an excellent point about it getting louder. Most of the airplanes that we fly nowadays have an intercom system, and the intercom is an electrical component. And so with a total electrical failure, you are going to lose the electrical system, so you might as well take the headsets off and as you said, scream at each other, because you're not going to have that ability. And I encourage instructors to do that with students on a flight. Just get out of the practice area and show them, demonstrate what it sounds like with the headsets off. And, most airplanes have a hand mic. Well, how would we actually communicate with ATC if we just had a failure of the intercom system? Do we have the ability? Do we have a speaker in the airplane? How do we turn the speaker on? And I know I'm getting off on a tangent a little bit and not really talking about an alternator failure, but that's something to think about. What is it like in the airplane with an intercom system failure?
Yeah, that example was a really good example, and quite frankly, when the master switch is off, that's exactly the scenario of the alternator failing and then that battery losing all of its power. The aircraft's going to act just like it would some 5 to 20 to 30 minutes later, whatever that timeline would ultimately be for that battery. You're in the same scenario. So I asked before we started recording, I'll ask it again. Are you having an emergency at that point?
And the answer is it just depends. Day VMC, I would say no, you're not. IMC, I would say, yeah, you probably are. Night, that's debatable. Obviously, if you're using an electronic form of navigation, GPS, VR, or anything like that, you would lose that with a total electrical system failure. But if you're very familiar with where you are, which you should be if you're flying VFR, you should be okay. You really should be okay and have some contingency plans. Maybe do you want to continue an extra 50 miles? It may take you another 30 minutes. I don't know. I can't answer that. The one thing that when I bring this up in check ride scenarios is the applicants are usually pretty good about talking through shedding unnecessary electrical equipment. If you've got a number 2 radio and number 2 navcom, shut that off. Certainly if you have some sort of iPad or something plugged in to a USB port or the cigarette lighter, unplug that to prevent the drain. They're pretty good about mentioning that. Sometimes they're not really that good about saying, I'm going to refer to a checklist. And that is really where we want to go on this, because if we have a systems failure in an airplane and we have a checklist that talks about or addresses a systems failure, that's what we want to do. Because in most of these airplanes, and again, the airplanes that I'm most of the time flying in are 4-place Pipers, Warriors, Archers, that sort of things, and Cessna 172s. That's mostly what I'm flying in to do check rides. The checklists, by and large, are going to try to troubleshoot and try to fix the problem and going to try to do a reset of the relay, and it's going to try to get that alternator back for you. And that's the ultimate goal. Gee, it quit working. Let's try to make it work. And there is a process in place, and it's right in the checklist. So all you got to do is read it and be able to follow the checklist. And there are. I know in our airplane, our 172, if we pull the power back, if we're doing slow flight or power off stalls, sometimes our alternator does drop offline. And just by following the procedure in the checklist, we can get it right back, and it turns into a non-event.
Right. And we talked about your failure. I had a failure with Devin Miller, who was on the show really early on. He can be found online at Family Pilot. Devin and I were out shooting practice approaches at nighttime, both instrument-rated pilots, making sure we're staying current proficient. And on our last approach back into this airport, Devin noticed that the alternator light, the low volts was on, and then that the alternator was at 0. It was not producing any charge anymore. And we were probably on a long final, probably 10 miles out from the airport. Pre-COVID, the tower was still open, and we were talking, I think, to ATC when we first noticed it, and we were switched over to tower shortly after. We alerted ATC, look, we're not having any other issue other than we notice our alternator is not producing a charge. We're having no issues, but we may lose communication with you. When you talk about the steps that you would take, of course, we pulled out the checklist and did our checklist, but what other actions, like alerting ATC, we've talked about turning some things off, would you consider in a number of different scenarios? And I'll throw a few obvious ones out to you. If I have landing gear, what are you thinking about as a professional pilot, Wally? What would be your, assuming it's obviously electrically powered landing gear, what would you be thinking about? Flaps, what would we be thinking about the flaps and how we would manage our flaps? If we're on a 10-mile long final into here, and we thought the battery was starting to go, do we go ahead and put them out or not? Let's talk about, I guess, those two scenarios: first flaps, then landing gear. Yeah. What would you be thinking if you were, obviously we were in an Archer, so no powered flaps, we have a handle, but let's assume we're in a Cessna, we have powered flaps. What are you going to do? Yeah, and as I thought about this, I've actually had 3 alternator failures. I had forgotten about this other one. Just trying to show me up now. I got one, he's got 3 now. Yeah. One was in a Bonanza. I was by myself, VMC conditions, wasn't a cloud in the sky, so weather was not an issue at all.
I was about 50 miles from my destination, so about 20 minutes out, maybe 20 to 25 minutes out, and I got an indication of an alternator failure. So I immediately pulled out the checklist and went through the troubleshooting, and I was not able to get the alternator back. So here I am working on battery power, and I did address shutting off unnecessarily electrical equipment. And in this case, it was daytime, so I shut off all the lights that I had on. I shut off my number 2 Navcom. I left my GPS going, which in this particular airplane, the GPS had its own internal backup battery being charged through the electrical system, but I knew that if I had a total electrical failure, I would still have that available to me. But anyway, about 50 miles out, I called up approach control. I was going to an airport that had a Tersa, and so I was out of their radar coverage. But I called them up and told them I was 50 miles out, and I was coming in, that I had an alternator failure, and that I may lose my ability to communicate with them. So immediately they cleared me to land. I'm 50 miles out, 25 minutes out. I was heading northeast, and they cleared me to land straight into runway 4. I was going into Monroe, Louisiana. They said, okay, you're clear to land runway 4. And so I did a couple things. I asked them what the phone number was for the tower. And they gave me the phone number, and I put it in my phone, so I knew, okay, if I get down low enough and I really need to communicate with them, I can call them up on my telephone. I have a Bluetooth headset, so I could speak to them through the headset. My next thought was, all right, what about my gear? I've got an electrically driven gear. I want to make sure the gear is down, but I knew I have the manual gear extension ability, but the thing that I really wanted to get was I wanted to get a green light before I lost my electrical system. So I made the determination that about 30 miles out, I was going to go ahead and lower the gear. My thought process was I probably still had enough power at that point, and it would give me enough time to do a manual gear extension and still aim toward the airport. So about 30 miles out, I went ahead and extended the gear, and I got green lights, so I was happy that the gear was down. And then I my thought was, well, what about flaps? Well, I went ahead and put the flaps down and made a normal landing using the normal flap setting. And lo and behold, I never lost anything. I taxied in with the being able to talk to tower and talk to ground, and it ended up being a non-event. But I had all these things in my back pocket had I needed them. The one thing that we see on check rides is, if we do have a total electrical failure, obviously it's in a electrically flap-driven airplane, it's going to be a flaps-up landing. The older airplanes, quite frankly, anything before about 1980, there is probably no data in the performance section that addresses no flaps. If you look at the newer 172s, and I say newer, I'm talking 81 and newer, there is, if you go to the short field landing distance chart, which is the only landing distance chart that is in there, it's a short field landing distance chart, there's a note. There are actually 4 notes on the bottom. If you look at the older airplanes, there are 3 notes, but about 1981, there's a 4th note. The 4th note says, for no flaps, add 35% landing distance, and add between 7 and 9 knots to your approach speed. Most people, most of these airplanes call for about 61 to 63 knots, somewhere in there, and most people probably fly more like 65. So according to this, the book is telling you to come in about 70 knots and add 35% to your distance. And when you look at the landing chart at sea level, the landing distance is usually somewhere around 600 feet. So adding another 35%, you're still below 1,000 feet. But it is something to consider, especially you get into multi-engine airplanes. You get into a beach barren or something, and you have a total electrical failure, and you're going to have to land with no flaps. How much more runway are we going to need? Do I want to go into that 3,500-foot runway with no flaps in this airplane? Well, that might be a situation where you might want to consider the airport down the road that's got 7,500 feet rather than 3,500 feet.
And let's assume you're in a Cessna and it's still VFR, but it is a really short runway, and you're concerned about distance. Would you put 10 out, or would you use all of it if you had some battery left? You did in your example. I'm just curious, what would the guidance be for a student or a private pilot if they had a short field that they really had to get? Would you use 10? Because you could go around with 10. I personally wouldn't go ever 20 in that scenario, because I could be stuck at 20 and need to go around and have a real problem.
That's the thing, is that when you put the flaps out, the flap motor is a fairly high draw item on the electrical system. And if you're going to drain a battery, it's going to drain when you're putting a draw on it. So by putting the flaps out, you're taking the chance that you may lose the total electrical system after the flaps are out, and now you can't retract them. So a consideration, especially if you're having to do an instrument approach, where you think you may have to go around and go to an alternate. I know we're talking about a really bad day, an electrical failure, going around, having to go to an alternate airport. That definitely classifies as a bad day. But a consideration may be, hey, I'm just going to do a preemptive strike, and I'm just going to make this a no-flap landing. Again, even no flaps in a 172 for a sea-level airport, sort of a standard to just a little bit warmer than a standard day, you're still looking at less than 1,000 feet. And most of us aren't flying into airports with less than 1,000-foot runway.
And I've heard it. I've heard it in the hallways. I've heard people say it to me. The initial thought process is land as soon as possible. I got to get on the ground. This is going to fall out of the sky. We talked about you flying another 50 miles. I might not go 200 miles. I might not go 50 miles.
Right.
There's all kinds of scenarios. We could say it varies. But do you think you need to divert and land right away? Is that the first thing you're going to be thinking about?
No, it's not the first thing. The first thing I'm going to be thinking about is trying to get that alternator back. And that's what the checklist will probably have you lead you into. Basically a reset process or a reboot. I mean, going back to our cell phones start doing weird things. The first thing we do is reboot it and start over again. And most of the time that fixes the problem. But the checklists, most of the checklists will say land as soon as practical. So what does that mean? Well, if I've got an airport if my destination is 30 miles away and my divert airport is 25 miles away, and I'm familiar with my destination airport, and maybe I haven't been there, but I'm familiar with what runways, I've got all the frequencies written down, I've flight planned for it, I'm familiar, as familiar as I can be with that airport. So going to an airport that's just 5 miles shorter, every situation is different. But don't be predisposed to having to divert to the nearest airport. Most checklists do not say land as soon as possible. They say land as soon as practical.
So that's a great, probably best practice. A couple other best practices. Obviously, we think about batteries and other sources when we're probably flying nighttime where we know we don't have another way to see something. We should have flashlights and headlamps at nighttime all the time. But this is a time where I think we definitely want different extra batteries. We definitely want to be able to take the iPad out of the console and put it into another source. What other things would we consider that might be helpful to us in a situation where we're losing the alternator?
Well, one thing that is I think is important is to keep your stuff charged. I fly with a lot of people, and maybe they're using an iPad, and I look over there and I see I say, you know, how's your what's your battery? And they go, oh, we're good. I'm at 51%, and I think, well, why wouldn't, if we have the ability to charge it in the airplane, why wouldn't we be keeping that charged? Because a 100% iPad is going to last longer than a 50% iPad. So just be prepared. Keep everything charged, you know, as well as you can. I think most of us would rather take off with full fuel rather than half fuel, even though half fuel may get us to our destination in plenty of, you know, with plenty of fuel, plenty of reserves, and safely. But I think most of us would say I'd prefer full fuel. Well, think of the charge ability of all your devices as fuel. If you can keep it full, let's keep it full.
Yeah, you make me think of a lesson I learned from one of my instructors, which was never use less than the full runway, right? Why would I ever take off with 51% of the runway available,
right,
when I could just go down there and get 100% of it? So
right.
Good pilots don't use 51% of their batteries, and they don't use 51% of the runways
right.
either. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode all about the alternator failure. And Wally's had 3. I've had 1. It's going to happen to you probably in your flying career if you fly planes with electrical systems at all. And there's not a reason to panic. There's a reason to use good judgment. There's a reason to have a plan and implement the checklist usage, and then that plan to make sure you make a good decision on whether you divert, turn, go back, land as fast as possible or practically possible. So hopefully you took something away from today's episode. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.